30. So I'm going to take you through those 4 sections. So when we're ready to go, Linda, is Mia in there, or is she? She's recording? Oh, okay. Good. We're ready to go. All right. Well, let's then just to give you an introduction. You've got your summary. We're dealing with the next to last chapter in John today. It deals with not so much the resurrection, because there isn't much about the resurrection of Jesus, but it's more about the responses to the risen Jesus. All right, so we're looking at basically faith responses. What is it about the risen Jesus that brings on faith responses to some of these characters? It says there, in the range of belief, there are different degrees of readiness and different factors that cause people to come to faith. So we're going to look at the reactions of Peter and the beloved disciple. We're going to look at the reaction of Mary Magdalene. We're going to look at the reaction of the disciples, and then that of Thomas. So, let's set the stage by looking at some of the points. And I'll point out a couple of things as we read the text. Okay? Early on the first day of the week, which in our context would be Sunday, while it was still dark, remember John uses that image of darkness. All right? Darkness here basically means that everything will be dark until one experiences the risen Christ. Okay. So early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciples set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying not with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scriptures that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. So there's a question here of seeing, and how these two came to, or did not come to faith. All right. Mary Magdalene was the first who went to the tomb. She does not go in. She just saw the stone rolled away. So immediately she ran to the disciples, and basically said, "They have taken Jesus. They have taken him. They have stolen him." And in a certain sense, because her reaction was, we use the word negative. They took him. They took him. She didn't know what to do. She does then lead into the positive reactions of Peter and the beloved disciple, especially the latter. Mary, she goes and, don't forget, she goes and reports what she had seen to Peter and the rest of the disciples. We have to remember that the beloved disciple, and remember, we don't know who that beloved disciple was. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. Some say John, son of Zebedee. Some say James. We don't have any proof. Beloved disciple is not named. But we do know that among all of these characters, the beloved disciple had the highest rank of all because Jesus loved him. So in terms of where does he stand in terms of his relation to Jesus, basically he has the highest rank. Not ecclesiastical rank, not a positional rank, but a personal rank, if you will, okay, in terms of his relationship. So Peter and the beloved disciple run to the tomb. They responded differently to what they saw. And that's the key word here. What did they see? Both enter and see the burial cloths wrapped up. One at the foot, one at the head. All right? They were wrapped and folded. All right? Let's see, where am I here? Excuse me here. Both enter, see the burial cloths, but only, if you notice, only the beloved disciple now comes to faith based on what he saw. And all he saw were these folded cloths. All right? He hadn't even experienced the risen Jesus yet. All right? Nothing is said about Peter's reaction. The beloved disciple comes to faith even before the risen Christ appears. Thus, according to John, the beloved disciple becomes the first full believer. Okay. We move to verse 11. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Right? She does this now for the first time. And she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So let's look at what happens. Mary returns to the tomb. This time she goes in, and she sees two angels sitting there. Neither they're talking to her, all right, nor the sudden neither they're talking to her, nor the sudden appearance of Jesus as the gardener brings her to faith. She hasn't come to faith yet. She was crying. And the image that comes across is one of the reasons she did not see Jesus was that the tears had clouded her vision. Again, symbolism that comes into play here. The questions that were asked, "Why are you weeping?" brings out this idea of her vision being blurred. Jesus asked her the question, a very important question, "Whom are you looking for?" Now, if you remember at the beginning of the gospel, when the disciples first came to him, he turned to them. They said to him that they wanted to get to know Jesus. And he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And then they followed Jesus, obviously then became disciples. But that phrase, "What are you looking for? Whom are you looking for?" bring with it this idea of, it's a question that probes discipleship. That indication of those questions, who are you looking for? All right, is a question that comes up in terms of where do you stand in terms of discipleship. Jesus calls her by name. Now, what is the image that comes up in view of John's gospel? The image that is evoked here is the image of the Good Shepherd. Okay? In John 10, he calls his, he's talking about himself as the Good Shepherd. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out, all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. So again, shades of the Good Shepherd image. She knew his voice. Okay? And so therefore, she makes the declaration. She goes to Jesus. She embraces him. All right? And his response is, "Don't cling to me." Some translations are, "Don't touch me." But that's kind of gentle. If you touch, you're not holding on. All right? It's not basically a touch to see whether I'm real or not. She knew well enough that he was real, but she runs up to him and obviously grabs a hold of him. And he says, "Don't cling to me because I have not ascended to my Father." The image here is that Jesus has not finished his mission yet. His mission will be ended when he is ascended to the Father, and then ultimately on Pentecost when he sends the Spirit. Okay. So she then runs to the disciples, and she says, "I have seen the Lord." Mary is the first one who proclaims the risen Lord. Now, a question came up beforehand. What are we talking about here when we're talking about faith? All right? Certainly, Mary had faith in Jesus. Okay? In Jesus as he was going through his ministry and so on. This is different. All right? Christians base their faith in the risen Christ, not the historical Jesus. So Mary, being this first to proclaim the risen Christ, is just that. It's a statement of faith that she has seen the risen Christ. It surpasses the other types of faith that we might have in relationships and so on. Now, when Peter and the beloved disciples come in and they see the burial cloths, and people would say, "Well, burial cloths here are folded up. Well, what's the big deal?" Well, we can look at it from 2 points of view. If the burial cloths were folded up, it's an argument against robbers stealing the body. The robbers are not going to stay around and neatly fold up the burial cloth. Okay? The second one, though, kind of brings to mind a contrast with the raising of Lazarus. If you remember in the story of Lazarus, Jesus tells Lazarus, come out of the tomb. But when he comes out of the tomb, what does he look like? A mummy. He's wrapped in the burial cloths. Okay. And again, it brings out the contrast because basically the idea is burial cloths of Lazarus weren't folded up as a fait accompli, but ultimately that Lazarus was going to need those burial cloths again. Whereas here, the folding of the cloths brings out the idea of a certain finality of resurrection. All right. So if I can find my way here. All right. So Mary is the first to proclaim the Lord. So we now move to Easter, what we would call Easter Sunday night. Same day. Now remember, the day started with Mary Magdalene going to the tomb, and it was dark. All right. Now, the disciples are sitting in a room with the doors closed, and as the scripture says, for fear of the Jews. Okay. So let's kind of read chapter 20, verse 19 to 23. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced, and when they saw the Lord, Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." So what do we see here? All right. Even though it was in the evening, there's no idea or questioning of darkness. Why? Because when Mary came back to them, they believed her. So when Jesus appears, they weren't surprised. I mean, they were surprised to see him appear, but they weren't in any doubt or surprise because they had listened to and believed the words of Mary. The translation, "Peace be with you," is a bad translation. Because in this context, we normally say and use the term "peace be with you" as a greeting. Okay. What we have here, the better translation is "peace with you." All right. Now, the reason is that the peace that Jesus speaks here is a fact, not a greeting. All right. It is the peace that exists with Christ himself. And by experiencing of that peace, all right, they become less troubled. There's a kind of a serenity that overcomes them. All right. He shows them his 4 wounds. All he does is show them. The disciples rejoice. Jesus extends his peace again and gives the disciples a mission that continues his own. That's the other thing that's important here. Jesus commissions them to continue his mission. All right, so the risen Christ says, okay, you have the peace, you have the Spirit, now go continue the mission that I have begun in the world. He breathes on them and gives him the Holy Spirit. Okay, again, obviously, those who are familiar with the Old Testament, it brings back images of the Ruach, the Spirit that God breathed into the first human. Okay. It has shades of Ezekiel, when, you remember the parable of the dry bones. Well, within that, he says from Ezekiel, from the four winds come, O Spirit, and breathe into these slain that they may come to life. So before the dry bones, if you will, come to life, Ezekiel calls on the Spirit to be breathed into them. So what are we asking or learning from this? As the first creation, God's breath brought into existence human beings in his image and likeness. Now, Jesus' gift of his Spirit makes the disciples God's children in the likeness of the Son. The breath of God in Genesis gives life. The breath of Jesus gives eternal life. Now remember, we're looking at this from the point of view of Christian belief. And just to clarify what we're talking about here and why is this, in a certain sense, important. First of all, it stems from my understanding of what religion is. All right? Religion is a way of interpreting reality. It's a man-made product that attempts to interpret reality. And from that point of view, it's no different from science. Because the purpose of science is to interpret reality. The difference are the modes by which they do the interpretation. All right. Science interprets reality via the method of measurement. All right. That's kind of the scientific mode. Faith, the purpose that religion is that it is seen through a filter by which to interpret reality. And for Christians, the filter by which Christians interpret reality is the risen Christ. That's, in terms of Christianity, we interpret reality as we look through the filter of our belief in the risen Christ. And that's very important. All right. So, and both of them, by the way, science and religion, there should be no contradiction between them. It's only bad religion that makes the dichotomy. If we're dealing with good religion, and that's a whole other topic, if we're dealing with good religion, there should be no contradiction between science and religion. All right? All right. So, what we see in this group now is that Thomas is not there. We use that term, the doubting Thomas. But Thomas is not there. In a certain sense, he becomes, interestingly enough, an element of disbelief. Okay. Sometimes he was called, the first scientist because he wanted proof of Jesus, of the resurrection. He wanted something empirical that he could not only see, but something he could touch. So a week later, we'll finish off the reading. Verse 24, but Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. Interesting. They proclaim the risen Lord to Thomas, and he still doesn't believe. All right? His own brothers, if you will. But he said to them, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hands and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So, here we have Thomas finally encountering Jesus. A week later, same place. And Jesus appears again, and he offers to Thomas, come here, Tom, put your finger right where you wanted to put your finger. Touch the wounds. Thomas never touches them. Okay. We all believe that Thomas somehow came to belief by actually doing that. The gospel itself says, mentions nothing about Thomas's doing that. Right? And yet, Thomas comes to an imminent act of faith. My Lord and my God. All right. So, his willingness to believe without touching is genuine faith. All right. He was a doubter, but he didn't have to empirically touch Jesus. He saw Jesus just as the other disciples did. They had come to faith by seeing him, and so Thomas does the same. He doesn't empirically touch the wounds. And so the one who embodied disbelief utters the highest confession of Jesus in the gospel, my Lord and my God. Yet Jesus blesses all future generations who will believe in him without seeing him. The conclusion, last two verses, basically sum up this part of the gospel. That Jesus had done many other things that the disciples witnessed, but were too many to put down here, with the idea that by his doing these many things, they were to carry this out, all right, and that others would come to belief through them. So, the interesting thing is, it seems logically that the gospel would end there, but we have another chapter left, which was an addition, probably not written by John, but which carries on the same characteristics, and that chapter we will do the next time, chapter 21. Okay?
Can you hear me? Yeah? Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Second. Hello, everybody. When Don and I started planning for today, the first thing that when we read about the four apostles or the four different reactions to the resurrection, I immediately thought about the Passover Haggadah. So first it takes during Passover anyway, but I thought about the Haggadah. The Haggadah is the book that we use on the Seder night, the Passover night. And in that book, one of the important parts of it talks about the different four children. That there are four children that the Haggadah talks to, and they list their different characteristics. So did anybody hear about the four children? No? So this is actually very interesting, because then I went and looked into the four different reactions, and I looked at the four different children, and I found a lot of similarities, and that it's interesting that there are four. But I'm not sure which to refer to whom. Like which should be I'll list the four children, and then as I speak, you'll try to figure out maybe which one is which, and then at the end, maybe Don can help with that as well, attributing. So the Haggadah talks about the four children. The first one is wise. The second one is wicked. The third one is simple. And the fourth one is the one that does not know how to ask. Okay, so if you've never heard about these four children, you probably are now very intrigued by it. But the commentators say that you can look at it in very different ways, because the whole story of Passover is about trying to give the next generation the belief in the same story that we're telling ourselves. Right? They did not attend Mount Sinai. They did not see the leaving of Egypt. And how do you keep that faith going from generation to generation? Last time we spoke about the lamb that they had to take and cover the whole lamb, right, and finish everything. So Passover is a holiday of community. People have to come together. So no matter who you are, we each have a role in this whole in the big picture. So from reading this, I feel the same way. I feel that the New Testament wants to tell us here that there are different ways to react to events, especially events that seem to be supernatural, and people will react to them differently. So I want to look at the four children and how the Haggadah treats them. So the first one is wise, and he says, the wicked one, what does he say? What is this service to you? He says to you, but not, I'm sorry, start with the wise. What are the testimonies, the statutes, and the laws which the Lord our God has commanded you, you in turn shall instruct him in the laws of Passover. One is not to eat any dessert after the Passover lamb. Why is he considered wise from the text of the Haggadah? Is because of basically one important element. And the important element is that when he asks the question, he said, what are the testimonies, the statutes and the laws which the Lord our God has commanded you? So our God, when he says our, he puts himself in the community. That makes him wise. So he doesn't know all the answers, but he knows that they have to do something to do with him. He's not out of the picture. The wicked, on the other hand, he is also a knowledgeable person, and he says, what is this service to you? Okay, and he says to you, but not to him. By thus excluding himself from the community, he has denied that which is fundamental. Therefore, blunt his teeth and say to him, it is because of that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. For me, but not for him. And this is key now. If he had been there, he would not have been redeemed. Okay, so that faith, that whole episode of the death and resurrection is like a bridge. It's a bridge that you can either take or not. And the Passover story is the same, is a bridge. And actually the word Passover, right, to pass over something. And the pass over something is to go from one reality to another. And really, it's not even about the event, because it's not even about, if I would ask Don after this in the Q&A part, if it's about the death and the resurrection itself and people witnessing that, he would probably say no. What it's about instilling the faith into people. So people have to also move from one state to another. And that state is that faith. But the faith is, again, it's a tool to move from, just like in the story of Passover, to move from, what are the states that we move from on the Passover holiday? From slavery to freedom. Right? And it's not, and we know that the slavery and freedom are not necessarily the physical slavery and freedom. And how do we know that? There's a very important evidence in the text itself from Genesis. Because if it were just about physical freedom, then the Israelites could have just waited for the Egyptian empire to fall. Because every empire rose and then fell. So they could have just left then. But the point was not to wait until it fell, because what they really needed is the spiritual freedom, is the mental freedom. So they had to leave Egypt. So really, that's the whole point. It's like, for example, if someone is addicted to something, let's say let's say drugs. If someone is addicted to drugs, and they use drugs until their money runs out, and they don't use drugs anymore because they have no money to buy it, right? Because they can't. They've not done the process of freeing themselves from drugs. All they did is that they don't have the physical ability to acquire drugs anymore. Or someone who's a rapist, but they're in jail so they can't rape because they're in jail. That's not what we're talking about. we want here the spiritual and mental freedom of people, that even if something is in front of them, they won't do it. And that's really the main point. We're now between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the Jewish holidays. And we say the same thing. It's that when do you know that you really repented for something, that you really are over something, is when you have the ability to do it, it's in front of you, and you don't do it. That's according to Maimonides. These are the actual, give me a word here. The standards of knowing that you're redeemed, right? It's in front of you, you have the ability to do it, and you don't do it. Okay, so let's say if using the drugs example, that you are in front of it, you have the money to acquire, you can do it, but you say, no, I can't do it. The story of Passover is the same thing. Taking the lamb in front of the Egyptians, in front of it, having it, but saying, no, we're not slaves anymore, we're leaving now. We're not waiting for you to not enslave us anymore. We are taking control here. So that idea of the bridge is similar in both stories. And the different four reactions are here as well. So when the Haggadah tells that wicked child that if he had been there in Egypt, he wouldn't have been redeemed, is because he, just like the wise child, sees and acknowledges the bridge. They both know that the bridge is there. But he chooses not to cross it. He chooses not to enter the next realm. And that's why he's wicked. Okay? Then the third child is the simple child. And what is the simple child? Simple child is someone who's not here nor there. He's not, he doesn't see the bridge, but he doesn't also oppose to the bridge. If the bridge would have been there, maybe he would have crossed. So he doesn't really oppose anything. And what does he say? He says, what is this? He has literally asked a very simple question. What is this? And then you answer to him, or to her, a very simple answer, but it's an answer that has some sort of physical evidence. Okay, and I think, I don't know all the four, to exactly connect them to the four children, but I believe that the simple one is actually, in my case, he's maybe called the doubting Tom, but doubting Thomas. But I actually looked into the word Thomas because it's supposed to be a Hebrew name, right? So it has to have some connection. And I I looked into it, and actually the word Thomas it's actually an Aramaic word. Which means ta'ama. Now, the simple in Hebrew, the simple child is called tam. Literally tam, which means someone who is a whole, is tam. I couldn't avoid the similarity, of course. The interesting thing is, though, that the etymology of the word ta'ama in Aramaic, it doesn't come from simple, but who knows? But it comes from the word te'om. Te'om means a twin. And then I did look at the other sources that says that he was a twin. So it comes from that word. But they have a similar, I don't want to assume too much, but it's very interesting that it's very similar. Tam and Ta'ama. So what is the answer that is given to him? Thus you shall say to him, with the strong hand the Lord took us out of Egypt. from the house of slaves. You know, it is a little bit similar of what is Jesus, in a sense, trying to do for his doubt, that he's not a doubter by nature. Right? He's not like the wicked that says, oh, I see it, but I don't want to cross. He says, if I just see something, just give me something. I'm not here, I'm not there, but just give me something. And to him, Jesus gives that, that, in a sense, that evidence that he needs, just to kind of have him cross over, right? Pass over. And then the fourth child is the one that does not know how to ask. And the one that does not know how to ask is probably the child that the whole Seder is for that child. Why? Because that child is so far removed that he doesn't know how to ask. He doesn't have, I'm using he, but it can she be she too, because he's so far removed that he doesn't even have the vocabulary of how to engage in such a discussion of a bridge, what that bridge means, a Passover. He doesn't know anything. So, and what does he, and what is it? So, of course, there's no answer, there's no question from him because he doesn't know how to ask. So what does it say? As for the one who does not know how to ask, you must initiate him. As it is said, you shall tell your child on that day, it is because of this that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. So for the one that does not know how to ask, it's our responsibility to come and to say, okay, I'm literally opening the door for you, or that showing you the bridge, bringing you to the bridge. So I'm not sure exactly which one goes to which in the four children and the four reactions, but I think that there's definitely correlation somewhere there. In my opinion, maybe Mary is the one that does not know how to ask. And I would love to have a conversation about this afterwards because I think it's fascinating. Even if there's nothing here, but just for the exercise to do that. Because Mary goes to the tomb, she doesn't go in, and then she seems like she's the most confused one. She doesn't know what this means. And she has to be explained. She has very good intentions, but somehow she seems to be the most confused. So these are the four approaches to different ways of faith, so different levels of faith. One of the things that I really see the connection here also is that it says that Jesus came back after 8 days. He returned after 8 days. In a sense, we, of course, in the Jewish tradition, from the Torah, 8 days is full completion. It's not just the creation, but it's the day after creation. It's the day after is the most important day, right? It's not the day that you finish your project. Is how do you feel about it the next day? And the brit, the circumcision, we do on the 8th day. And a lot of things, there's many things that we do. The tabernacle was created for a certain amount of time, and they brought the sacrifices, but only on the 8th day God received that, and on the 8th day they were able to go in. Moses was able to go in. There's a lot of, we don't have to repeat that here, but the 8th day means that process of creation was done, and then it's time to enter. Same thing on the Passover. Passover is 7 days, and And then, of course, on the 8th day means that you're beyond that, the Passover. So you're on the other side of that, bridge. So those who believe cross over. Some of them have issues to cross, and some have less. What I found interesting is that they each had a different way of approaching it, even physically. So, for example, the first one was Mary. She saw it first, right? But she doesn't know how to interpret this. So she goes and she said they took his body, right? She kind of comes into a conclusion that may actually not be correct from the New Testament's theological perspective. His body was not taken. And then the beloved apostle, he runs faster than Peter. So in a sense, there's a childish reaction to it. I want to do it, but you know what? When he gets there, he doesn't enter. Peter, on the other hand, is not so fast to run, but once he gets there, he goes in. And that's a lesson too. Our faith is not a blind faith. It's not about jumping over the bridge. That means that it's not a mature perspective. If you walk, you can kind of digest it, and then you'll be able to cross the bridge. And then the other apostles, and Thomas, who needs some of the evidence to go in. Once they're in the cave, and that's another very interesting connection between this episode and the story of Passover. There's different interpretation of why we eat the matzah on Passover. So the Torah tells us that they had to rush, right? They had to rush to leave Egypt. So even though they left, and there was a statement there, we're not staying here until your empire falls and doesn't enslave us anymore, we're taking responsibility, but still it was not complete. Why was it not complete? Because they still had the fear. They left out of fear. They left in a hurry. Here we see the opposite. And that is what Don, of course, emphasized, the idea of that the clothing was folded. If it was somebody who just kind of left in a hurry, then you wouldn't take the time to fold the clothes, and it would be a kind of a messy cave. But you can see that it was folded neatly. Now, I would like to know from Don the connection between the feet and the head. Why was it important to put the feet next to the shrouds, next to the feet, and then to the head? That would be an interesting question. But nonetheless, you can see that there's in this whole story, what I found the striking difference is in the story of Egypt, there was such a sense of urgency. And we have to rush. We have to get out of here. But on the other hand, in this story, I didn't feel any sense of urgency that much. I mean, they were upset, like Mary was upset that somebody took the body, but there was no sense of, Peter doesn't rush there. The other apostles, they run, but they don't go into the cave. There's something about the clothes are neatly folded. There's this idea of we're not in a rush too much. Unless I'm reading this wrongly, but I think I felt it in the text that there's no sense of rush, and I feel that this is actually, in a sense, a completion of the story of Egypt. that leaving in a hurry. Here, there's more mature, complete understanding and faith. Of course, after that, when Jesus comes back and he breathes into their where the students are together. Of course, this is a spiritual revival, and of course, it reminds us of the story of Genesis when God created Adam and blew the spirit into his nostril. And I looked into the Hebrew word in the Hebrew New Testament, and they use the same word as the word is nafach, same word as God used is used in the story of creation in Genesis, that God blew the spirit in the nostrils. The same word is used here with Jesus and the apostles. And then, of course, it's also, that's on the individual level in Genesis when God creates one person. But the story of Sinai, Mount Sinai, then it's on a communal level, on a national level, that God breathed, in a sense, His word, right, the Torah, the law, into a nation and makes it complete. So these are all interesting allusions to Old Testament stories. One thing and with that I will conclude, is that bridge itself. Jesus in this episode is a bridge, but he is also in a state of still bridging himself, right? So Mary cannot touch him or cannot do anything because he is still in that transition. That's a very interesting thing. We see that in several instances in the Torah, but the famous one I would say is the Jacob's ladder. When Jacob has the dream, and he has the dream of the ladder of the angels coming up and down, and really he understands that there's some connection between this world and some other world, and in this case, and it's the same geographical area as well, Jesus becomes that bridge. I don't know if you've ever seen that story, the movie Ghost, with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. I thought that's interesting because I'm sure this was somehow, that movie is somehow was influenced by that when we die, the body doesn't go immediately, disappears immediately. That for me is always the idea of, and in our sources say that it takes 9 months to be born and 9 months to die. So when we stop breathing, we don't leave this world immediately. It takes time. And of course, that's why we do burial and not cremation. That to me is interesting because if this is something that is in the New Testament and it's a Christian belief, how do you then harmonize it with cremation? I don't know. Maybe we can hear from you. So this is the idea. That whole episode is about an example of how there is a bridge and how we need to move from one state to another. And in a sense, Jesus in this case, just like in other episodes in the New Testament, he comes to just kind of help us through this. That's really what I feel in these stories, which means that these states exist anyway, but he just comes here to show us that how to do that. So of course, it's relying on Jewish stories and ideas, of the story of Passover and a bridge. So, as we say, life is a narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid. And so all these reactions to crossing that bridge, that narrow bridge, a lot of times are reaction to fear. So if you're afraid, you don't want to cross it, leave the unknown, or go into the unknown, and so forth. So here it is, the bridge and the 4 reactions to crossing it. Thank you. Okay, we have
We have a little time?
Can you?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. How long have we been doing this?
Almost 3 years.
Okay. An overview. Question for both of you. I like the way you complement each other. Yes. All right. My question is, over these 3 seasons, let's put it that way, is there 1, 2, 3 things that you picked up from the other person? For whatever, it doesn't have to be any relationship between what we discussed, but some idea, some feeling, something that, I didn't see that, I saw this, whatever.
Well, I mean, my first response was, and again, we who kind of taken faith for granted and the Gospels, the first thing that struck me was how excited Gadi got over learning the New Testament. There was just an excitement there, which he had never realized